Hello, welcome. It's great to see you all here. Thank you for joining us for another edition of our Scientists and Strategists series. I'm Audrey Kurth Cronin, Trustees Professor of Security and Technology and Director of the Carnegie Mellon Institute for Strategy and Technology, or CMIST for short. At CMIST, we focus on the smart development, use, and governance of emerging technologies that are reshaping war and peace. This speaker series is an opportunity for scientists and engineers, on the one hand, to come together with strategists and policymakers on the other for in-person discussions that seek common understanding and groundbreaking insights into their work on new technologies. It's a privilege for me today to introduce our speaker, who is a leading voice at the intersection of emerging technologies, national security, and global cyber policy. Dr. Adam Segal is the Ira A. Lipman Chair in Emerging Technologies and National Security, the Director of the Digital Cyberspace Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Segal holds both a BA and PhD in government from Cornell University, as well as an MA in International Relations from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. His expertise spans cybersecurity, technology development, and Chinese domestic and foreign policy, all critical issues shaping the digital age. Hopefully we'll touch on a few of those today. Throughout his distinguished career, Dr. Segal has advised policymakers, written groundbreaking reports, and played a pivotal role in shaping U.S. cyber strategy. Most recently, as senior advisor in the State Department's Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy, he led the development of the United States International Cyberspace and Digital Policy for the country. For his work at the State Department, Dr. Segal has just won, in fact, just last Thursday, the Cyber Policy Award of Merit for International Policy Impact, and it was presented by Microsoft and the Institute for Security and Technology. You should see it. It's an amazing trophy. I mean, it's got Atlas on it. He's holding up the world. I mean, this is an amazing guy that he could have a trophy like that. I mean, I don't know what I could ever do that would earn me that kind of a trophy. I'm so impressed, really. You should look online for it. It must be quite heavy, though. Yeah, so carrying it home was a bit of a... That's what I was hoping. All right, anyway, Dr. Segal's insights are sought after in the highest and widest circles of government, academia, and industry, and highly awarded as well. A prolific author, Dr. Segal has written extensively on the geopolitics of cyberspace, including his most recent book, The Hacked World Order: How Nations Fight, Trade, Maneuver, and Manipulate in the Digital Age. And the book he published right before that was Advantage: How American Innovation Can Overcome the Asian Challenge, another vital topic. And that book came out in 2011. So if you're getting a theme here, Dr. Segal is always ahead of the curve. He's always commenting on things that are of interest, some years after the things he writes come out. And that's not an accident. Dr. Segal's thought leadership has appeared in the New York Times, Foreign Policy, the Wall Street Journal, and Foreign Affairs. And he continues to shape the global and national discourse through his Council on Foreign Relations blog, which is called Net Politics. With a career spanning research institutions, universities, and government advisory roles, Dr. Segal brings a wealth of knowledge and a nuanced understanding of the challenges and opportunities in today's digital landscape. It's a real honor for us to have him here today at Carnegie Mellon University. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Adam Segal. Thanks for coming in.
Yeah. Thank you, Audrey, for that very, very kind introduction, and thank you to CMIST for bringing me here today. So what I'm going to do is talk about a book project that's kind of in progress. So hopefully you guys can give me some good feedback so I can actually finish the project. And that project is looking at US-China tech competition, but I'm trying to do it through a different lens. So the way that I've generally frame it as that there are at least three big lenses for thinking about the competition. One is the National Innovation Systems methodology, which says, China has a top-down, state-directed method, and the U.S. has basically relied on this triumvirate of private sector, U.S. government funding federal science, and then the private sector commercializing it. And what are the strengths and the weaknesses there? That's one of the main schools. The second is a growing sector-by-sector approach, right? So are we winning in AI, or are we winning the quantum competition, or are we winning synthetic biology, which is another way of doing it. And then the third is a competitiveness around governance issues, right? So the US doesn't traditionally have a lot of governance in this space, right? We don't have a national data privacy law. We have lots of sectoral laws that regulate data, but we don't have a national law. But under Xi Jinping, China has rolled out a national cyber law, AI plans, and all of these other things. And both sides are trying to project that influence globally. And so how do we think about that competition there? Those, I think, are the three main approaches. And what I'm taking is an approach that focuses primarily on the relationship between the government or the state and the technology firms, right? So how does the state think about that relationship? And getting that relationship right is very critical to shaping that technology competition moving ahead. And I think you can look at statements from both Chinese leaders and US leaders that they both see that as really, really critical. And I was just describing this project to a venture capitalist in California, and he's like, oh, that's actually, sometimes I frame this question the same way. Should the United States have civil-military fusion like China does, right? Should we somehow have closer relations with our private sector? Could we do it in the same ways? Would we want to do it? And so in some ways, that is the kind of framing question about what that relationship should look like and how we should move forward. Now, I think we can think about the tech firms having three critical importances for the state in this competition. The first one is the source of innovation, and that innovation increasingly drives national security, right? So well known to all of you in this room that private sector is doing more and more basic R&D. The federal budget has been generally flat. The spending of the big firms in some places actually outpaces what the defense primes is doing. And so we're increasingly reliant on what the private sector does to fund innovation. And that is glaringly true in artificial intelligence, right? If you can see in National Security Advisor's Jake Sullivan's speech at the NDU when they released the National Security Memo, he talks about we are dependent and critically dependent on what the firms are going to do, right? They're really driving this relationship forward. And you see similar things in China, right? Of course, the clearest example of it is the highlighting and the prominence of this idea of military-civil fusion or civil-military fusion. Now, this idea has existed in China for almost 40 years. The Chinese have been trying to do this for a very long time. There's been numerous commissions and other organizations that have tried to do this, but like many things, it has been elevated under Xi Jinping. He directs the Civil Military Fusion Commission. We see increasing resources going into private firms. We see in the civil sector, for example, in cybersecurity, private sector firms actually playing a leading role in this space. So it is at a further place where it's going forward. And also in the Chinese system itself, private sector firms are doing more R&D than the state or universities were in the past. So that is also going up. So innovation is the one that we hear about the most, but it is the one that is, I think, very central to moving forward. The second is a range of foreign policy issues where the state relies on the private sector. These tend to be most clear around digital governance or internet governance. Right, so the United States and the tech firms for most of the Obama administration had shared interests in free flow of data, open internet, multi-stakeholder model of governance. That relationship, of course, became extremely tense after the Snowden revelations. And so the firms tried to distance themselves from the US. And encryption has always been a tension between the private sector and the government and the uses of private sector. But for the most part, we continue to see pretty close alliance and shared interest between the private sector and the government on how we should govern or manage digital spaces. And in China, we see tech firms playing a similar role, right? So the Chinese promote this idea of cyber sovereignty, like multilateral institutions for discussions of these areas have a much more controlled vision of cyberspace. And Chinese firms in international standards boards and other places promote this view. They cooperate on the ground. They promote this view. We know that people are brought back to China for training about how you govern information spaces, and they are often taught about how to govern cyberspace. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China and the Digital Silk Road, China builds out infrastructure. And Chinese firms, in many cases, just drape themselves in the banner of the Belt and Road Initiative, right? They're following investment, but it helps them to say, yeah, we're part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And it's kind of a mutually reinforcing relationship there. In this space also, we see some what we can call kind of norm entrepreneurship, right? Companies taking the lead and trying to promote ideas, and Microsoft is probably the clearest example of this around what became the Paris Peace Accord, but for a long time they used to call the Cyber Digital Convention, or the other ideas like that they promoted as a kind of independent actor. Didn't get a lot of traction with the US government. In fact, the US government really did not like it. But they managed to promote those views in a number of forum and continue to kind of promote those ideas. So the second area is around these foreign policy objectives. And the third is what we might call tech on the front line. Michael Brown just had a piece in Foreign Affairs maybe 2 weeks ago, and there he talks about the increasing reliance on the tech firms to provide security or defense services, especially what we saw in Ukraine, right? So AWS moving critical Ukrainian data to the cloud, Microsoft and others providing cybersecurity services, and then of course the example of Starlink providing internet and then choosing not to provide internet in some cases. So we really see that playing out on this kind of third category of tech on the front line. So those, I think, are the three areas where we see the tech companies playing this essentially important role in geopolitics. Now, of course, this is not new, right? The governments have relied on states for services and foreign policy influence before. Companies often push against or promote their own foreign policy, right? We can go back to the East India companies or the oil companies, but I think there are some important differences, right, compared to the extractive industries. In those cases, the influence was very directly felt on the countries where those resources were being extracted from. The tech companies, because they control the data of hundreds of millions, if not billions of people, touch on countries around the world, a vast number of countries, and they touch on more areas of sovereignty, right? It's not just a question of resource, it has to do about content moderation, democracy, information flows, taxation, and other spaces. So I think the reach is greater. Now, I am not arguing for technopolarity. I don't believe that the firms have a unique degree of power, or that they are in a sense of power in themselves. I think we have to think of it as a relationship between the state, and the state can give and it can take. Right now we're seeing in a period in the United States of giving, but we can also see where states take that power back. where we, I think, are now, well, let me talk about what I think we had in the Biden administration, then I'll end with where we may be going now. I think we saw both in China and in the United States an attempt to restructure that relationship. Now, in China, it was very clear, right? We saw the techlash, right? Jack Ma gives that speech in 2020, 2021 about financial regulation. The Chinese state claps back very hard. Jack Ma disappears for several months. Trillions of dollars wiped off the ledgers of Ant and Didi and all these other companies. But this was in part done by political motivations, right? To make sure that Jack Ma and the other tech CEOs didn't get too powerful. But it was also about the type of technology that Xi Jinping wanted to see developed. He wanted to refocus the companies away from, amplifying algorithms or shopping apps or other social media apps, right? There was a op-ed in the People's Daily that said, you guys have done great work bringing the price of cabbages down, but it's time to move on to hard questions like semiconductors, new materials, and other things. And so the attempt was to refocus the companies away from social media. And we did see companies begin to invest in their own new hardware. So Quantum and Alibaba and Huawei and all the others started investing in chips in other places. And so China moved the tech firms very quickly and reshaped that relationship very quickly. The Biden administration, of course, could not move that quickly. And there was, I think, one big inherent tension in what the Biden administration wanted to accomplish, which was the very strong focus on anti-monopoly and regulation coming out of the FTC, right? So it was very hard to send a consistent message about working with the private sector on some of these issues at the same time as the Biden administration was pursuing anti-monopoly and other cases. And you can see this very clearly, for example, with the USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative, stepping back from the traditional support of free flow of data in U.S. trade negotiations. And I'm not speaking out of turn here. The rest of the U.S. government, because I was at the U.S. government at the time, didn't know this was coming, right? So USTR made this statement. State and Commerce, who were arguing in lots of other forums about, no, the U.S. still promotes the free flow of data, didn't know that this statement from USTR was coming. And the reason I can say this publicly is because Ambassador Fick, is who I used to work for, was called up in front of the Senate, and the Senate said, when did you learn about this announcement? And Ambassador Fick said, this morning in the news. So there was this very strong tension in the Biden administration about regulation and anti-monopoly things. But overall, I think, especially on the foreign policy and on the defense sector, the Biden administration wanted to increase coordination, information exchanges with the private sector. The National Cyber Strategy has a large section about working with the private sector and how the private sector should be taking the lead in defending and increasing the security of software. Audrey was kind enough to mention the international strategy. We had a whole section in there about how we couldn't accomplish anything without the private sector. And in our relationships with close partners, we tried to align on the private sector as well. So you can see, for example, on the Quad, the relationship between India, Japan, the United States, and Australia, there are a number of tracks, for example, on quantum, that involves the private sector, discussions and movements there. And then on the innovation side, a kind of continuation of work that started under the first Trump administration and under the Obama administration about building out things like the DIU, the Defense Innovation Unit, Army Works, and all the things that you guys interact with a lot at CMU. But how do you make sure that the warfighters get technology as quickly as possible, right? Is that through different types of procurement strategies, but also do you need to have outposts in these places? And you saw the budgets for all those things under the Biden administration going up. And then finally, you saw some attempt to regularize or create procedures for cooperation with the tech sector on providing security to states being under attack. So under the government side, you have what was called the Tallinn mechanism. So that was the US government, but Estonia, Ukraine, and others coordinating about what type of technologies Ukraine would need. And then on the civilian side, you had the Cyber Defense Associative Collaborative, which tried to bring all the firms together so the two sides could then meet and say, yes, this is the tech we're going to need, this is how we're going to license it, this is how we're going to move forward. And you see a lot of thinking about how that might apply in Taiwan, which we can talk about more, but that I think is going to be much more challenging. All right, so let me conclude with some questions I don't have answers to, which is kind of where are we, what's going to happen now? Because we're clearly in a state of churn, maybe is the nicest way to put it, but restructuring of the relationship. And the reason why I asked the foundation for at least another year to finish the book is because lots of things are in play. I think it's easier to talk about what's happening on the Chinese side, right? So on the Chinese side, in reaction to a lot of what the Trump administration is going to do and what the Biden administration has done around export controls, this increasing focus on greater reliance, right, and autonomy and autarky in chips and other places. That's had positives and negatives for the Chinese innovation system and the relationship to the private sector. On the private side, on the positive side, it has fostered lots of relations between tech companies and universities, which didn't exist before. That was one of the great weaknesses of the Chinese innovation system, was that there was very little contact between research that was happening in universities and the firms. And because of the export controls, you see that growing very, very quickly and developing in ways that is going to make China much more innovative over the long term. On the negative side, as the state has been kind of pushing itself more and more into funding and the growth of state-led venture capital. The private venture capital has collapsed in China. We don't see a lot of private opportunities there moving there. Now, DeepSeek is an interesting kind of question for the Chinese leadership, because DeepSeek's breakthrough did not come out of a tech firm, right? It came out of a hedge fund that in many ways is structured in ways that Chinese tech firms are not, right? The degree of creativity and openness and distance from the state that the big Chinese tech firms don't have. And so one question would be, do the Chinese adopt that? Is there some lesson there that they can scale or move forward or affect things there? On the US side, I think lots of questions across the board. And there are, like in all administrations, some pretty clear tensions in the Trump administration coming in. On the one hand, clearly the relationship between the tech firms and the state is going to be very, very close, right? We saw it happening even at the end of the Biden administration, right? Meta, OpenAI, all these firms rewrote their guidelines and principles about working with the national security state and said, we are going to support democracy in this conflict. So it's not entirely a Trump echo, but it is going to accelerate, I think, under President Trump. And the growth of venture capital and others around this idea about investing in defense tech is also going to accelerate because of the people around Thiel and others that are going to see, and depending upon who gets placed in DOD around procurement, we could see lots and lots of reforms that make those companies, have access to more resources there. But there is, in the populist wing of the Trump administration, a desire for anti-monopoly and breaking down big tech. Now, a lot of that is driven around content moderation and free speech issues, but some of it is driven by economic populism concerns. And the person who went to the FTC, who had worked with J.D. Vance, tends to frame it in economic populist terms, not content moderation. And so I think there is a tension in the Trump administration about how that plays out. So that's a big question. On the foreign partner side, of course, the president tends to see alliances as transactional, but Secretary Rubio's first meeting was with the Quad, right? And so there is I think a large contingent of China hawks inside the administration, Michael Waltz being another one, who see alliances, especially Indo-Pacific alliances, as being critical to competing with China, and also see investment in critical technologies as being critical to competition with China. So there's also going to be, I think, a tension between the people who see that investment, CHIPS Act, and other things as being important to arguing with China, and the Doge people, right, who want to cut everything and then figure out where things lie. And there's also the messaging. I very, very quickly read the speech that J.D. Vance gave at the AI action today. But the part that hit me the hardest was where essentially he says there's going to be a US tech stack and a Chinese tech stack, and you need to choose. And there's another line where he says, doesn't mean we have to go it alone or we want to go it alone, but I'm sure everybody else heard that other line first, which is there's going to be us and there's going to be them, and you're going to have to choose. And that has typically not been a particularly effective message to the emerging South about what technologies to use and how to move forward. So how that goes forward and how the US thinks about bringing in others to compete with China and where the firms fall in that thing, I think, is another big open question. I'll stop there, Audrey, and we can go from there.
Thank you. So we're going to sit right here.
Yeah.
You want to bring your water?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Adam.
Yeah.
There's a lot there. It's hard to know where to start.
Probably too much.
No, not too much. Very enticing. Well, I have the lucky privilege of being able to talk to you for a few minutes before we open it up to the audience. But all of you smart people in this room, please be thinking about your questions, because I'm sure I'll fail to get to all the incredibly cool things that are on your minds. All right. Well, I wanted to pick up, Adam. You were talking about the changes in policies of Meta and Facebook, and I wanted to specifically talk about regulation, because of course the AI Summit, it seems to be a major shift there.
Yeah.
So this has gone back some time. It's not just been in the last 3 weeks. Social media companies like Meta and X have reduced their content moderation, reduced their fact checking. That's been a longer term trend. And of course, the Trump administration rescinded the Biden administration's AI guardrails, AI executive order. But and then even more recently, you had Macron stand up and talk about how instead of taking pride in European regulation, which has been the main theme up until now, he's talking about trying to cut red tape, increase computing power, and make Europe more friendly to tech investors. So this looks like a tremendous gutting of the whole movement. I mean, if the Europeans are speaking in this way, they've been always so proud of the Brussels effect and the fact that they've been leading the way in regulation. So let me just ask you, do you think that the process of creating AI guardrails is over?
No.
All right.
I mean, one, it's, Macron never speaks for all of Europe, right? Macron speaks for France. And I think I think the pendulum had to swing some way back. And for some reasons out of US national interest, right? In some ways, the message about guardrails and safety and security, especially, again, for the global South, made them think, this is so dangerous, we're going to control it, and we're going to, hand it out under our terms. And the Chinese were taking advantage of that. You could see there were 2 resolutions passed at the UN and the General Assembly, one that the US led on and the Chinese signed, and one the Chinese led on the US side. The US one is very much focused on responsibility, safety, and the Chinese has those words in there, but I think also then talks about innovation and providing, we're going to make sure it fits with your development goals and all those other things. So I think there was some extent that we did want to adjust that messaging and talk about how others were going to have access to it. You know, look, the firms are still going to have to convince the American people and the world that we're not going to be harmed by these technologies, right? And I think we are starting at a point where there is a fair amount of skepticism about the companies and how the technology is going to impact on us. And so I think the companies, I did see, for example, they released a report in Paris about how they are meeting the voluntary principles and how they are moving forward with them. So I think they're going to still see the messaging there. And you know, again, I don't know where we're going to end up with DOGE and all of this other things, but I think the U.S. system tends to regulate by sector as opposed to trying to do one national policy, and I think we will still see controls on AI applied to health data and things in that space. And internationally, there are still, I think, shared incentives, not necessarily about AI is coming to kill us all, the kind of that narrative, but there are still shared incentives about AI and command and control systems, and what types of weapon platforms do we think should have a human in the loop and those types of things. Those discussions probably will continue.
Don't you think that concept, though, of human in the loop has been long left behind? I mean, we have systems that are moving so quickly. If you look what happened in the war in Gaza, for example, just the ability to use Lavender and Gospel and systems that were moving very, very fast to create large numbers of targets. What does that mean to have a human in the loop if you've already got
as soon as I said it, I was like, I shouldn't have said that.
Oh, sorry.
But no, it's all right, because I was just also thinking about my colleagues had written a piece about making exact this point, that there's no way we can ever keep a human in a loop for some systems. But I think you can still build accountability into a system, right? So even if the human is not constantly making the decision, there still has to be a decision where humans to deploy or other things, and there still could be accountability. Now, we're living in a world right now where the accountability around war crimes seems to has broken down in many, many ways, but I think we could probably, that's the focus, as opposed to, as you said, having somebody making decisions is not going to happen.
Who's writing this? Because I'd love to.
This was a piece in Foreign Affairs by Sebastian Elbram, who's a UVA computer scientist, but he's a technologist in residence at CFR right now, and Jonathan Painter, who is a Staunton Fellow at CFR.
I'll look for that.
Right.
Well, let me just ask you, earlier you were saying that the tech companies are going to have to adjust to popular views of fear of AI, or clearly the effects on individual workforces and jobs and so forth are happening very quickly, and that seemed to be the case, a year ago. But don't you think now that the degree to which money is driving the trend toward building large frontier models has kind of tipped a little bit? It's not really that they're worried about whether they're popular or not, is it?
Well, I think there is this narrative now about you have to get as big as you can as quickly as possible, and I think part of that is driven with the competition of China, right? So the argument is being, if we don't do it, the Chinese will do it.
Yeah.
I don't think it's that much domestic driven. I think it's primarily driven by that argument, especially the way that Altman and others have talked about it, is we want democratic systems to win. I think that's right, but I think once people start seeing the application of it to their lives, and I haven't looked at the surveys recently, but mostly people are pretty worried and skeptical of it, that we'll see some of the pushback there.
Okay. Let's talk about DeepSeek for a minute.
Yeah.
So distillation, getting data from OpenAI's model and using it to train DeepSeek's model, that's one of the things that they've been accused of having done. It's very common to use other people's models to train your own model, but do you think DeepSeek was technologically innovative to the degree, especially that it's been presented?
Yeah, I'm a little bit skeptical of my answering questions about machine learning and AI at CMU.
All right,
but
we'll move on then.
no. So my understanding, and please correct me, my understanding of reading all of the numerous hot takes out there is that there was an innovation there on the architecture and scaling side. It was not an unexpected innovation that people thought that this breakthrough could be made, but they made it. And so they clearly, it wasn't all based on distillation and stealing. So that is my understanding of it, that there was an innovation, wasn't something that people thought was impossible or surprised them on that front, but it was an important breakthrough.
Okay. Well, I get corrected constantly by
I'm
our colleagues on machine learning, so I understand where you're coming from on that. But let me just bring it down to a more practical level, and particularly a pet interest of mine. So I wrote a book called Power to the People, which is all about how technology's impact on the world has more often been as a result of spreading accessible technologies to a large number of people, rather than necessarily technological innovation. If you look at the large number of technologies that have been very important. And I'm not the only one that's made that argument, but one of the most disruptive technologies in warfare was the Kalashnikov, which is a very ordinary piece of technology. So here's my question. Do you think that DeepSeek is the Kalashnikov or the Model T of artificial intelligence? I mean, was it so cheaper and able to be spread more quickly? Are the Chinese actually making AI technology more accessible to less developed countries, as they claim?
So I don't think we're there yet, right? So the worries around AI tend to be, can individuals construct bioweapons? Does it give them ways to do things that they couldn't do? And my sense is, although the guardrails in DeepSeek seem to be terrible, that they're easily broken, but again, most of what I can tell is that it's not much different from doing a web search, right? It has not provided new capacities yet. Google just released a report last week, I think, or 2 weeks ago about AI and cyber. Same thing, right? What we're seeing is that AI helps the attacker, but really at the margins. And so, helps you with social engineering emails and phishing emails, get the language right. You can scale slightly faster, but it's not providing, a huge number of 0 days or code that people couldn't do before. Now, the trajectory would seem to suggest that eventually it'll be something else, right? Just given what we've seen and how wrong we've been on the projecting how far these things go up. But right now, it's not the Kalashnikov.
So what do you think is the right American policy if that trajectory is going to become, if various forms of cheaper and easier to access artificial intelligence become worldwide spread?
Yeah, so another way to put this, right, is the tension between, do controls work and what can we hope for them? And I do think controls are important. They have an effect, but they're not. We also need to be building resilience at the same time. We need to be preparing for a world where the controls no longer work. So I think they should happen in parallel. The chip controls clearly. I don't think the DeepSeek proves that the chip controls don't work. I think that the chip controls prove that they do have an effect. They should continue to be in place. They will eventually not have an effect, but they're, and we also need to be focusing on this resilience side. How does American society, deal with the inevitable attack that's going to come with these technologies? How do we deal with the disinformation? How do we deal with the displacement? All these other things.
Can you expand upon that point that you just made about the chip controls actually working? Because some people, of course, you well know, argue that this shows that that they didn't need, either they used more chips than they said they had, or this only increased innovation within China. So why do you feel that?
Again, drawing on multiple hot takes, I think there's 3 or 4 ways you can say the chips don't matter. One is, as you said, is they use more chips than the number that was out there. Two, the head of DeepSeek said our biggest constraint is chips,
Yeah.
right? So that means that chips are a thing. Three, they still have to scale, right? And so the model itself, like you still need to scale and you need chips for that. And then I think the most important reason is that, I'm very influenced by the argument that Jeff Ding makes about, the importance of AI is not just the model, right? It has to do about the diffusion of AI broadly. And chips are going to matter a lot for that, right? You need to have chips throughout society to diffuse models very broadly. And so we're clearly slowing them down on that side too.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. Okay.
Thank you, hot takes.
Yeah. All right. Let me ask you about the relationship between governments and commercial companies in another hot take, I'm afraid, with respect to what's happening right now with Elon Musk.
Yeah.
Throughout history, at least at some of the time, there's this desire to have separate commercial policies that don't reflect political policies because you're worried about the blowback from your own consumers.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem to be an issue right now, and I find this unprecedented. Perhaps you feel differently, but it does seem to me that there seems to be enough power now that it doesn't seem to matter if there's a blowback or not. What do you think, Adam?
Yeah, I was thinking about this morning, and I can't decide how much of Elon Musk is a tech story as opposed to the op-ed in the Times this week or last week about a capture story, right? That this is really a story about a very, very rich person being told you can do whatever you want by the Trump administration. Like, we like your ideas. Some ways it's a tech story because, he is, he controls Twitter and SpaceX but Zuckerberg similarly, right? They have these stock structures that allow them to control the companies and not face any blowback there. Although, Twitter has been bleeding money ever since he took it over, and, he can continue to fund it, but it'll continue bleeding money. So I don't know if it's a tech story as opposed to the Trump administration's just like if he had been the, I don't know, but the CEO of Disney and he was a billionaire and came in and did something similar, it would kind of be the same story. I think.
So this is not the East India Company.
It is right now because Trump is, the administration has decided that he is pushing in the same direction that they want him to. Now, how long that lasts, right? How long does Trump continue to share the limelight with Musk? Does he step on some toes? Those are all things I have no way of predicting.
Things seem to be moving very fast.
Yes. Well, supposedly the cover of Musk behind the resolution desk really didn't make the president happy. So.
All right. Well, so I'm going to shift just briefly because we have a lot of great colleagues here on campus who are doing work on trying to find alternative sources of energy. From a global perspective, the hunger for computing power is so enormous. And that means new demands for data centers and a huge thirst for energy. And we're not even talking about Bitcoin and all of that, but that's also relevant. So how can we build extremely powerful and dominant AI models at the same time that we're trying to reverse climate change? Are we all headed toward much more reliance on nuclear power, as the French claimed yesterday?
Yeah. So again, not my specialty, but my sense is, given how much that the firms themselves are investing in and researching small nuclear reactors, that we are going to move back into a kind of a nuclear age. DeepSeek certainly, the argument that you can build architecture that doesn't use as much energy. And then a colleague of mine just blogged about a Duke University study that just came out this morning about actually not having to build huge amounts of new grid and power sourcing, that if you, that they can, through different ways of balancing or other things that I didn't understand, actually rely on a lot of the current grid. So it could be that the demands are moderated in ways that we don't know yet, but I do think alternative is going to play, it has to play a much larger role if we're worried about, coal and other climate change.
Yeah, or else we all just move to Mars, right? Isn't that what many of our tech leaders want us to do?
That is also our possible future, yes.
All right, well, it's time to open the floor to you brilliant folks. So, yes, back there. Wait for the mic, please.
Good afternoon, sir. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Duvall. I'm an active duty Army officer in the War College here, part of the CMIST team. So I'm grateful to be able to give you a question. So in the lens from a DoD perspective, and I know you touched on this a little bit in your brief, and then we always, as military folks, look at the history, look in tune to things that occurred, how innovation really kicked off between World War II, World War I, and so forth, especially different authors like Richard Lester, Michael Piori, and others. And then from that perspective, really, you look at the hierarchical networks and then firms. Given these historical relationships, as you kind of discussed, between the U.S. tech companies and the government funding, how could the Department of Defense better leverage its private sector innovation, particularly in AI, hypersonics, and space capabilities, while also addressing these concerns through which you mentioned some regulatory burdens, intellectual property protection, and then really talent retention in the era of rising competition. So as you laid out between U.S. and in particular China.
Yeah, so I think, look, there's at least kind of three competing strands right now in that argument, right? There's the kind of 18 thesis, if you saw that, what's his name from Palantir posted about how to change procurement from the DoD and what that will do, right? Then you have people like Palmer Luckey basically saying, no, we just need a whole new set of primes, right? The Anduril's of the world are going to be a new set of primes, and we're just going to have a completely different relationship with them. And then I think you have that kind of hybrid, right? We're going to have a mixture of these new companies competing more with the things there, and we're going to, is it a tweak of procurement? Is it a tweak of, cost basis contracting and all these other terms that I kind of know what they mean, but not really. So all of these things that I think are going to be adjusted there. Look, I think the change is going to be pretty radical, right? It's going to be different than just continuation of the DIU, Army Works, that kind of model, or the In-Q-Tel kind of model, where we're like, look, there's a valley of death, and we need to figure out how to scale that technology more. I do think we're probably going to have pretty radical change on the procurement side, and because of the larger trends about investment in defense tech and the kind of opening of the gates between the Trump administration and the people around Thiel, that firms like Anduril and others will get a lot bigger.
You mentioned in your talk that there were different ways to look at the contrast between the United States and the civil military fusion model in China. And you made a tantalizing statement about whether or not the United States should have civil military fusion. Do you have an opinion on that?
I do. We should not.
Are you willing to share it?
We should not. The Chinese system doesn't really work right? There are some now increasingly pockets of places where the private sector is providing some capacity to the Chinese military, and cybersecurity is probably the clearest one. But the idea that I always found the idea that the Chinese are managing software and data and this kind of cutting edge technology better than the US military to be pretty specious. I just find it very hard to believe about what we know about how the Chinese DIB for so long was so moribund, and and of course making predictions about how bad things were in China and what they are now is a losing game. But I still think they still want to, when they talk about military civil fusion, they're talking about building what we have, not that they have something better than we have. But I think the relationship, I still, I'm a little bit afraid we're going to go too far. And I think that the too far is on the the possibility of waste, fraud, corruption. Clearly, on the if we dismantle all of the regulatory kind of authority side of things that the Doge seems to be very focused on. But also, I'm a little bit worried about the race to the bottom, right? I don't find the argument that we can't have any regulation because we need to beat the Chinese to be convincing. And so I'm worried on that side too.
Okay, other questions? Yes, in the middle.
Hello, sir. Thank you for coming. Lieutenant Nicholas Hamby. I'm with the United States Space Force here studying at CMIST. My question for you kind of relates to the information security discussion that you brought up earlier. So with the European Union's General Data Protection and Regulation Act, do you see this becoming burdensome to them as tech companies who are data hungry may be unwilling to work with them in the future?
Yeah. So look, that is increasingly a narrative. It's always been the narrative from the U.S., right? And increasingly a narrative inside of parts of Europe, right? So Audrey mentioned that Macron is, saying that we can't make the same mistake we did with the regulation. This report that came out several months ago by Draghi, who was the Italian foreign minister, about Prime Minister, thank you. The Italian Prime Minister that basically criticized the EU on regulation and said, we went too far, we need to invest more in innovation and space there. U.S. firms have been saying that yes, we already can't do certain types of business here. I think it's going to differ with, certainly differ across European countries. I don't think the EU is going to, right now, has totally accepted the argument that the Brussels effect, right? So the ability to use these regulations to shape international governance around this thing is still their superpower. I mean, yes, they do still think there is a drumbeat for more investment and more innovation. And at the AI discussion today, I think they announced $50 billion investment in AI infrastructure. So they're going to try to maintain parallel, but the Brussels effect is still, I think, has a huge amount of support amongst European bureaucrats, and that's going to continue.
There was a hand in the very back, please.
Hi, I'm Isabel Leong. I'm studying information systems here. I'm really interested in kind of the relationship between Starlink and the Russia-Ukraine war, and then kind of how that aligns with the U.S.'s ambitions in foreign policy. And then you also talked about Microsoft and Google.
Yep.
Where do you see that relationship going in the future, and how will those companies either align or not align with U.S. foreign policy?
Yeah. So the Starlink example is great, especially when it comes to Taiwan, right? So, Taiwan, all the data comes from cables, which are cut quite often by accident. So the Taiwanese know this, and they know they're going to have to rely on space for internet. Starlink would be the natural, because they have the most satellites up there. But Musk tweeted that we should consider Taiwan like Hawaii, right? And that it should go back to China. And reportedly, Putin told Musk not to sell Taiwan as a favor to Xi Jinping. So the U.S. government is thinking a lot about that, and the Taiwanese are thinking a lot about that. Taiwanese have talked about putting up their own satellites, but that takes time. And they're going to contract. They're contracting with the Europeans now, but also not enough. And then Amazon. Right? Now, the larger issue is that none of these companies, the financial stakes in Ukraine were pretty small, and Russia were very small compared to China. And so that, that's why everybody's thinking about how is this going to work the next time. There's practical reasons why it worked with Ukraine also, because Ukraine war started 2014, and Microsoft and all those other people were on the ground for a very long time, and there were lots of personal relations, and people knew each other, and they could take advantage of that. Also doesn't exist as much in Taiwan, although probably under the radar, there's a lot of conversations happening now, but nowhere at the scale of Taiwan. So I think there's a lot of thinking about what's going to happen if there is a Taiwan scenario, because it's not clear the firms will show up in the same way. And I don't have an answer to what that response should be.
So they're not interested in protecting TSMC?
I mean, they might be, because their exposure to China is getting smaller and smaller, but they still have exposure there, and they still still have people on the ground. They still rely on China for certain products and everything else. And I don't think it's about defending TSMC per se. I mean, it's part of it, but I think it's more. It's just the calculus is a lot more complicated than it is for Russia.
In the middle here, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Banke Adam. I study mechanical engineering here at Carnegie Mellon. And I wanted to ask you a question kind of geared to these big tech firms' involvement with the government, especially as we mentioned, Elon Musk and his involvement in Doge, and Vivek Ramaswamy was also involved previously in Doge. And we kind of see Tim Cook's being invited to the presidential inauguration, and other big tech CEOs. And we see this kind of collection of big tech CEOs kind of forming, and their influence on governmental maybe decisions or foreign policy or whatever it may be. Could we see this as dangerous, or I kind of wanted your opinion on the safety of that?
Yeah, look, I don't think it's great for democracy, right? I mean, none of those people were elected, right? And democracy is based on accountability and transparency, and certainly the lobbying of those people around the administration doesn't look to have any of those things. Now, look, we've had lobbying forever, right? And we've had big companies lobby forever, and we have rules and regulations around that. But right now, certainly, I didn't get a chance to read the story, but there's a graphic in the front of the Times today that shows all of the agencies that are supposed to be overseeing Musk that he's dismantling. So from a democratic accountability transparency perspective, not great.
Can I just ask you a question to follow up, and then we will get to, is there a question? Okay, you're next. But let me just ask you this question, Adam. You talked about guardrails being resiliency in responding to the future of machine learning and various forms of AI. Isn't that what we did in cyber? I mean, you're the cyber expert, not me. But I'm not so impressed by how well resiliency has worked in cyber.
But we did it after.
Okay.
Like, we built the system, well, kind of doing it the same thing again, but yes. There's a lot of not great echoes here, right? We built in cyber, we built the systems, and then we're like, oh crap, now we have to defend them. And then we started patching on defense, and then we even later started talking about resilience. Like, we started saying, oh, system is going to go down no matter what we do. How do we bounce back that? So I guess, yes, history is not particularly reassuring on that front, but hopefully us and your institute and all these fantastic young people out here can make that argument now and say, let's do this before it happens again. And I think we're at the point now where hopefully we can make those arguments. It's not too late, but I think cyber is definitely the story of we got around to it a little bit too late.
Wow, that's quite a challenge. Okay, in the back, sir, please. And tell us who you are, don't forget.
Hi, hello, thank you so much for your time. I'm a current student at Heinz College doing my master's in public policy management. Again, great talk. We have been talking a lot about how the influence of technology companies is increasing fastly on the government, but I don't think that no one has mentioned how the government is slowly but surely running out of money. Social Security is about to expire in 2033. The interest rates stay steadily high. So how can the government react to this lack of available capital versus the increasing influence and necessity of investments in very expensive technologies?
Yeah, so I think part of the problem that we have in the US right now is the state is not in a very good place, right? So not only, as you mentioned, is the financial resources issue for the things that we need to do, but on the state capacity side, also diminishing pretty quickly, especially on the personnel side, right? I think part of the negative effect of the wherever Doge ends up is going to be a loss of a lot of expertise, plus an unwillingness of young expertise to go in, right? I mean, you guys probably know better than I do, but my LinkedIn is filled with people who said, I thought I had this job, it was just revoked, what am I going to do, right? If you're that person 5 years down the line, you've already spent 5 years in the private sector, you're probably not thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to go back to the government, right? The government has missed its window of taking advantage of your expertise and your talent and your energy there. As Audrey mentioned, I just finished a shortish stint in the government, 14 months in the State Department. I was brought in under a special authority that was to bring private sector, although I'm not really private sector, but to bring out of government expertise in. And I had a lot of the stereotypes about U.S. government service and in my mind about how bad U.S. government technology is, and some of that was true. But I also met people, for example, who were working on, undersea cables and LEO communication systems for 20 years, and they knew a lot, right? And if you lose those people, you lose them for good. So part of the story that I, hope for the U.S. depends on state capacity, and that I'm very worried about.
Your time in the State Department you were part of such a creative group, and I know that you were a creative driver of that group. Can you tell us what you felt was your best achievement, but also the agenda that hasn't been achieved yet that you think is really desperately needing additional expertise?
So I can't take claim for anything, because I was the Twitter account, you have one job, right? I had one job, which is to write the strategy.
Well, that's a big job.
It was a big job, but it was like one thing, right? And so I was very lucky to be in the bureaus. Only when I joined, it was 1 year old, but Ambassador Fick became the head of it about 7 months before I joined. Ambassador Fick, had come from both the Marines and an entrepreneurial background, and so leadership was very important to him. And he showed it every day. So from a learning perspective, it was just very interesting for me to see how somebody shapes a new structure inside a very old one, and how do you create a culture of change and innovation and all those other things. I would say from the strategy perspective, I got it done, which is in the U.S. government actually, and I got it out. Right. So in some ways that is the success, right? Because I basically wrote it myself. I had no staff, and I had to get it past 18 other agencies. And that, for the most part, was easier than I expected because the NSC liked it. If the NSC had not liked it, then we would not be having this conversation. But the NSC liked it, and then there were one or two other agencies that dragged their feet, but eventually, because of Ambassador Fick's relationship with other people higher up, he could resolve those things. Now, I think the strategy, what the strategy failed to do, but I think quite honestly was reflective of what the Biden administration at large failed to do, is the strategy itself never really talks about how do we engage our adversaries, right? It talks about building relations with our allies. It talks about what are we going to do for the global South. It talks about the private sector, but it doesn't say what do we expect from conversations with the Chinese or the Russians on these topics, and that's because one, because of the Ukraine war, so we're not talking to the Russians at all. And then on the Chinese side, because of the balloon spy incident, and we pretty much stopped all discussions there. So it's a pretty big oversight lacuna in a strategy not to have some kind of thoughts about how do you talk to your adversaries or what do you want from your adversaries. Now, my official response to that is when I was asked that when I was still in the administration was, no, it's in there. We talk about engaging with them in international organizations and other things like that. But I think that was a pretty big failure. And if I was going to go back and push harder again, I would have pushed harder for that.
Wow. Well, thank you for all that honesty. I mean, you had to have put so many hours into that. I'm not sure I could have been so objective about something I wrote.
Well, I see the thing is that they have to do a new one. So by law, by the NDA that created the international strategy, every new administration has to write a new strategy. So even when I was finishing it, I was like, I can't get too attached to this.
Wow,
Yeah.
okay. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Trish. Oh, I'll stand. I'm a senior studying econ and politics here at CMIST. I was really enjoying the conversation that we had about DeepSeek and the different kinds of trade policies, restrictions, and controls that we have in response to these newer advanced AI models. And so I was just curious, how can we better prepare our critical infrastructure and also frame our cybersecurity policies in response to these more advanced models that do not require as much like money, manpower?
Yeah. So I think there is a lot of work going on right now about figuring out both applications of AI to defense, which right now seems to be better than the offense, so that we have a little bit of a runway there and building resilience there. It no longer holds, but one of the Biden EO's executive orders on cybersecurity was about CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, working on AI and critical infrastructure resilience. I think CISA will end up much smaller, but I think those are things clearly that the administration is going to want to continue working on, especially as we worry about Volt Typhoon and other Chinese operations directed at critical infrastructure. So I think there's going to be a lot of work there and investment there. I think it was, I'm trying to remember which one it was. It was either Palantir. One of the AI companies is already working with DARPA, I think, on self-correcting software. So I think a lot of work is happening in different places. To go back to the money question, it's probably not at the scale that we need it, but I think it's definitely happening.
Just to give two little quick plugs about CMIST things, on critical infrastructure in the physical sense, in terms of utilities and security against cyber threats, not so much AI thus far. But anyway, we have a brand new report that just came out. Our Director of Studies, Harry Kresa, out of the Washington office. You might want to read it. It's called Sunshield, and it's all about how greater protection of critical infrastructure is one of the reasons to use clean energy and to have clean energy resources is because there's much better resilience against attack. And then the other plug is that if you've not seen Ambassador Nathaniel Fick's conversation that is on our website about his own life and leadership, I think you'll find it very inspirational. This is a tough time for federal government service, but this is an amazing guy who did both. He served in the Marines, but he also served in private industry and also served in our federal government. And it's a great inspirational, at least for me, example of someone who's a role model that you can follow. Even if you don't go directly into the federal government, it's possible to do public service at many points along your career. I mean, actually, I think that careers are quite different now than they might have been 20 years ago. You're probably not going to have the same job, for more than 3 or 5 years. You'll have a different job after that. And the key thing is to educate yourself well and to be able to adjust to different situations and to have those core leadership and critical thinking skills that Ambassador Fick so beautifully demonstrates. If you really want to have a more uplifting message in this difficult time, I recommend looking at that on our website. So plug ended. But Nathaniel Fick, Ambassador Nathaniel Fick is just an amazingly wonderful person. There were some other hands. Nadia.
Thank you so much, Adam. Nadia Kostyuk, assistant professor at CMIST. So I'm excited to read your book. When is it coming? Next year?
I have to finish it.
Okay. But anyway, so basically I'm interested in the big question here. So your book talks about how US, China both think about state and tech companies' relationship. So obviously you highlighted pros and cons of both approaches. US seems to be doing a little bit better, at least under the Biden administration. But I was wondering, is there any sort of ideal scenario in terms of this relationship that you can paint to, or maybe we can borrow some of the pieces from different countries, etc. And how, in this ideal world, would this shape the other two components that your book doesn't talk about, which is the governance issue, projection of competition globally, and the regulation of the sectors or something like that? Thank you.
Yeah, so if I knew what the ideal relationship was, I could finish the book. Okay. In a way, because the problem with finishing the book now is that things are changing so dramatically that trying to say this is how things are is going to be a losing game, right? As soon as I get the book out, 6 months to a year from now, depending upon or a year and a half or two, depending upon what publisher I manage to get, that's a losing game. So the way to solve that question is, right, this is what it should look like, or this is the structure that we should put in place. And I'm trying to figure that out. In my mind, right, it is a mixture of, kind of a domestic regulation, a set of kind of normative expectations, or what sometimes I think of as patriotism or other types of framing, and then what it is the firms do, right? So also kind of firm guidelines. And how to balance those three, I have not figured out yet, and there's probably a fourth or fifth category, but my brain tends to work in threes. So right now, that's how I see the kind of the end structure there. And yes, I think you would borrow from all those things, that all the ranges of areas of competition, because the firms play a role in all of them, right? They help socialize norms. They're part of the national innovation system. They make governance decisions. So all those things are in place. But I don't know what the structure looks like. Again, to go to the historical examples, I think I finished my third book on, Democracy's Arsenal or American Forge, about what happened in World War II, trying to draw some lessons there. But it's, again, history, maybe it rhymes sometimes, but it doesn't, completely map. So there's some things I think to learn from those examples. I haven't figured out if there's other international cases, because there aren't many other countries that have the same tech structure in place, and the Chinese don't really give us that much thing there. So yeah, not a great answer, but that's what I'm struggling with right now.
I can take one more question if it's very short and concise. I think there was a hand on the right, wasn't there? No? One concise question. Yes, sir. This is it.
Okay.
Wait a second.
Yes.
And identify yourself, please.
Hello. My name is Will. I'm a senior undergrad here at CMU. We're talking about defense AI technologies, talking about Palantir. I watched a video by Palantir explaining Palantir Gotham, which is one of their defense technologies. And they use this phrase that I have been unable to stop thinking about, which is, how can we deter the next great war? Yeah. Do you think great wars are prevented through technological deterrence, is my question to you.
Ooh.
Yes, so you've actually, I've been thinking about writing a paper on the foreign policy theories of the tech CEOs, because that idea.
Oh, how interesting.
I don't steal it though.
No, I won't. Right. I promise.
Because
I'm looking for it.
I was like, this is because several of the tech CEOs have made that same argument, that if we have tech supremacy, we will deter the next war. Altman made a similar argument. I have a little chart going on now.
That's cool.
I shouldn't have said it in public, but anyways.
Your secret is safe with us?
So I think it's a common theme that they think that we can deter conflict with tech supremacy. Now, I think there's, and I texted a friend of mine who works on tech diffusion and stuff, and I was like, does this make any sense to you? Like, this is not how the world works. Like, one, DeepSeek suggests that there's not going to be a monopoly on it, so it's going to be hard to deter. We're not going to have predominance in a technology. And even if we do, it's going to be very short-lived, and so we're not going to do that. And then two, it's not clear to me that tech supremacy deters actors, right? I mean, Hamas is a great example. Right? We just saw a war where Hamas clearly was the weaker power technologically, but they still fought. So I suspect that it won't work that way, that we will not be able to deter any future conflict, that we're never going to be so powerful that no country, does not have some interest. Now, they may not choose to fight us in ways that we want them to fight us, which is generally what happens, but they'll still find ways to fight us.
Isn't this, though, just an extension of our somewhat naive view that nuclear weapons would deter all war in the 20s? I mean, it's just an extension of how we tend to think. That was that was a kind of a technology.
Yes.
The difference is that it's a different kind of technology, yeah?
Yeah, so we had deterrence at the upper level, and we had lots of wars at the lower level. So, although maybe because AI goes up and down the violence stack, that we can be able to kill people instantaneously, no matter where they are, based on drones in the sky and picking people out of crowds and whatever else. But I don't think so. I think you're right.
God, can we end on a more positive note,
yes.
please?
Go into government service. Yes.
Go into government service. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Adam.